I most warmly and with great appreciation would like to particularly welcome our eminent guest and guest speaker of today, Mr. Dijsselbloem. Thank you truly for having accepted our invitation to deliver the 7th Europa lecture. We are very proud and honored to welcome you today and to hear your ruminations on the euro and the crisis that we have faced and are perhaps still facing in the EU, and particularly also to listen to your reflections on your time as president of the Eurogroup. It is a great privilege that you will share with us some of your insights and experiences. Thank you. I will pass the floor in just a second to my colleague, Professor van den Boogaard, the chair of the EU Law Department at our law school and director of the Europa Institute. And then he will introduce the speaker and the lecture to you. But please allow me to still take one moment to express my gratitude also to him for organizing this prestigious lecture series, which brings such esteemed speakers to Leiden University. Professor van den Boogaard heads the Europa Institute, which is one of the oldest academic institutions specialized in EU law. It was created in 1957, which, as experts know, and undoubtedly you all are, is the exact year that the European Economic Community was created. The Institute is famous for its publication. It teaches our students and our fellow academics on EU law, which, after all, is an area of law that permeates all others. And occasionally, such as today, the Institute brings Europe to Leiden. And it does so in a very physical manifestation today in the person of Mr. Dijsselbloem. I very much look forward to this lecture, and I thank you, Stefan, for organizing it. And I gladly pass the floor to you to introduce. Thank you.
Meneer Dijsselbloem, Madam President of the Senate, Excellencies, Madam Vice Dean, dear colleagues, students and friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Leiden. I'm glad that you've all gathered here today in the wonderful setting of the Klein Auditorium of the University in Leiden for, it has already been said, the 7th Europa lecture of the Europa Institute. Only 7 weeks ago, many of us were here as well, in this room, for our Lustrum conference on Brexit and the future of the Union, one of the highlights of a year stacked with activities to celebrate the 60th anniversary of our institute. To show that we have recovered from our festivities and that we are firmly set on turning also this new decade for the Europa Institute into a success, we are back here today, hoping to start the new year with a bang. And how could we possibly do that better than with an Europa lecture? The idea of the lecture series is to let a distinguished speaker reflect on contemporary issues of union law or significant developments in the European Union. Since the very beginning of the government debt crisis, we at the Europa Institute have studied the law of the monetary union, making it one of the pillars of our research program, the progression of EU law, accommodating change and upholding values, following, critically analyzing and commenting on legal developments in academic, professional and popular public publications. Together with our colleagues from the universities of Delft and Erasmus, we even set up a separate European research center on economic and financial governance to further interdisciplinary research on the matter. It isn't long ago that a single currency was heralded as a paradigm of successful European integration. I vividly remember the scenes of enthusiasm that New Year's evening back in December 2001, with people temporarily interrupting their festivities and happily queuing outside at cash dispensers and enthusiastically waving around with the new and colorful euro bills. It's strange to see how that same euro has been the subject of so much controversy the last couple of years. It's fair to say that the government debt crisis has shaken the euro area and by extension even the union as a whole to its foundations. In 1999, 11 member states, and by now even 19 out of 28, irreversibly fixed their exchange rates and gave up their national currencies. But at the height of the crisis, when it was really all hands on deck and sauve qui peut, women and children first, a Greek departure from the monetary union, or even a return to the drachme, the lira, or even the Dutch guilder, suddenly no longer seemed remote or unrealistic scenarios. From 2010 onwards, European leaders have invested a lot of time, effort, energy, and capital, political as well as financial, into preserving the euro. To speak in the words of Chancellor Merkel, scheitert der Euro, dan scheitert Europa. Now, since January 2013, a Dutchman, the Minister of Finance of the then recently formed Rutte II government, has become a very prominent figure in the existential Eurostorm, entrusted as he was with the task of captaining the Eurogroup boat into uncharted waters. Jeroen Dijsselbloem, born in Eindhoven and educated at the universities of Wageningen and Cork in agricultural and business economics, has held the steering wheel of the Eurogroup firmly in his hands for 5 years, until he was replaced only last week by the Portuguese Minister of Finance, Centeno. In this period, he has weathered quite some storms, such as the one in Cyprus in 2013, where there was a lot of popular outcry when it was revealed that the financial rescue plan involved a private bail-in, or the difficult negotiations on the third financial assistance package for Greece in the summer of 2015. But Dijsselbloem proved to be a man for all seasons and not just an efficient crisis manager. Over the past years, he has also played an important role in the search for structural solutions to the crisis, in particular with the creation of the banking union. And so it came that when he left office last week, the monetary union sailing in calmer, even if not yet entirely untroubled waters, he was reportedly saluted by his peers in the Eurogroup with a standing ovation. Meneer Dijsselbloem, you recently called presiding over the Eurogroup the best job in the world. I'm therefore very glad that you have accepted our invitation to come to Leiden and reflect upon your years in Brussels. The floor is yours.
Always an intimidating effect for the speaker, not just to climb up here, but to then see this hall. It's a great joy and honor to be able to speak here today and just days after leaving the job to reflect on what it was all about, what we've gone through, what we have achieved. To do that, I would like to start by saying that in my mind, not just the EU is a community of values, but the same is also true for the Economic and Monetary Union. This is an expression that's used very often, for example, lately in the discussions about the legal system in Poland. Europe is a community of values, of common values. But it's also true for the Monetary Union. As in every community, it's about rights and obligations. It's about solidarity, and that goes with responsibility. And that's also very true for the Monetary Union. That was the idea from the beginning. It was neglected over the years, and I think we've come to learn how dangerous it is to neglect in any community the principles of solidarity and responsibility and the fact that they go hand in hand. Some of those values have been formalized, have been put into treaties or legislation, and some have been accepted as political principles, political agreements, outlining the responsibility of member states. In cases these values have been put into treaties or legislation, of course, the Commission, certainly at a European level, the Commission is what we call the guardian of the pact, the guardian of our common rules. But it never alleviates the member states from their responsibility. This is true for any community and also for the monetary union. The responsibilities of the member states are still very strong and ever have been. After the start of the euro, yes, some joint institutions were set up. Yes, there was a common framework. Yes, there were budgetary rules. But the responsibility of member states in terms of the size of the instruments, the scope of the instruments they have, has always been very strong. To give you an example, the fiscal tools, the budgetary power that member states have in their hands is altogether 50 times the size of the EU budget. But also other macroeconomic tools that have been so important in these years, income policy, taxation, pension system, labor markets, housing markets, etc., are all in national hands, and I think they will be for some time. So the role of member states is still very important, and this is a strong point to keep in mind in all phases, before the crisis, during the crisis, and after. Tying our destinies together, that's what we did when we started the euro. We tied our economic destinies together, and it required coordination. Coordination and applying to become a member of this Eurozone required also that member state accept some rules, basic rules. The most famous ones are, of course, the maximum 3% deficit or the maximum 60% in sovereign debt. The euro was a decision to lock in our interests, politically and economically. Of course, we all remember the political context of that time, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the strong need to tie Germany into Europe, to tie Germany and France together, to interlock their interests. And we all realized that member states that would join into this project, that would participate in this monetary union, would win and lose. What would they lose? They would lose some of their sovereignty. They would lose their independence, their ability to set out their own monetary policy. From now on, that will be done by the ECB, which, by the way, is, of course, a much stronger institute, with much more firepower than all these individual central banks had. Also, member states lost their possibility to manipulate exchange rates, to devaluate if they felt the competitive edge was lost, or to use and manipulate interest rates to stimulate the economy. So member states have to give up on sovereignty in a number of areas. And in return, the member states got stability. And indeed, after the start of the euro, there was a long period of monetary stability, no more exchange rate crises. Not many people remember, but if you go back, ever since the 70s, Europe had many exchange rates crises in which markets speculated against currencies, forcing national governments or central banks to devaluate or to step out of the monetary mechanisms. Leaving that speculation behind was a great asset, a great improvement in terms of economic stability. Also, the start of the euro brought a period of very low interest rates. Interest rates had been very different in many countries, of course also reflecting very high levels of inflation in some of those countries. So the new period we then entered after the start of the euro was one of less and less inflation, lower and lower interest rates, no more exchange rate competition, no more forced devaluations. The understanding in all member states was that having left behind, having lost some of these instruments, which can be so helpful if you are in an economic weak period, would mean that member states had to step up their efforts on all other areas, on all the instruments that they do still have, in macroeconomic instruments. These would have to be used well. Economies would have to be reformed. Politicians would have to address the macroeconomic imbalances in their economies. They could no longer go for the easy options that sometimes monetary policy provides. There was one assumption that was very clearly in the legislation, in the treaties, was the no bailout clause. It was Article 125 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. Member states would not take over sovereign debt, in other words, a reflection of budgetary problems, the reflection of not dealing with your macroeconomic issues. Member states would not take over each other's debt. And that was a very fine principle, but in the times of the crisis that were to follow, it couldn't be upheld, and it was turned over. The period before the crisis that I described, low inflation, low interest rates, plenty of money available at low costs, created a massive credit boom throughout Europe. Not just, as sometimes popular is the belief, in the south of Europe. The credit boom was all over Europe, also here in the Netherlands. To give you some examples, in Denmark and the Netherlands, very comparable, mortgage debt in that period between the start of the euro, and I know some of you are thinking Denmark wasn't part of the euro, and you're right, which also makes a point that this was not just caused by being part of the euro. Interest rates were low everywhere. In Denmark and the Netherlands, mortgage debt ran up to 300% of GDP. So the total of debt that people took on to finance their homes was 3 times the annual wealth level of these countries, 300%. The banking sector in the Netherlands exploded in size, up to almost 6 times GDP. In Spain, credit to the private sector went from 100% to 200% of GDP annually. All of that went to real estate, creating a massive housing and real estate boom in Spain. In Ireland, house prices went up in a very short period of time, 155% increase in house prices. And the Irish banking sector exploded from 4 times GDP to 8 times the size of their gross domestic product. The credit boom was massive, it was everywhere, and national governments did not act, did not use the instruments they had to push it back and to control it. In Greece, household spending in that period, between the start of the euro and the start of the crisis in 2008, household spending increased by 40%, roughly in 6 years' time. All of that was done by borrowing money, very simple. A lot of the borrowing was done by the government. Deficit of the Greek government in that period, and this was in the good period, ran up to minus 15%. And the government debt in Greece was already over 100% at the end of this boom period. Another thing happened during that period, and I'm just telling you this to understand how we went into the crisis. Because sometimes more attention is given to how did we deal with the crisis, but too little was given to how did we actually enter into this crisis. Another thing that happened in that same period was that productivity dropped sharply. In Europe, productivity increased 4%, 3%, all the years during the 70s, the 80s, and started to go down. And before we entered into the crisis, so let's say at the beginning of this century, it was on average in the Eurozone down to 1.5%, while wages were jumping up. all through the Eurozone. In Spain, productivity increase was 0.5 percentage point, while wages increased in that pre-crisis period by 35%. So wages exploded, productivity was almost at a standstill. Any economist can tell you that a sound productivity and wage development goes roughly hand in hand. In Ireland, productivity was a little higher. I think it was 1% in those years. Wages went up 45%. In Greece, as I said, roughly 40%. Europe lost its competitive edge in a period in which it should have improved it, while the welfare state and the costs of the welfare state throughout Europe increased. The imbalances were everywhere. So it's important to understand how we went into the crisis and what mistakes were made to understand the crisis. The first thing that happened, of course, at the start, you all remember, Lehman Brothers, was that leading European politicians said, this is not a European crisis at all. It's an American crisis. It's being imported. It's not our problem. Yes, our banks are interlinked, very unfortunate, but it really, in essence, is something about mortgages in the US. Very untrue, as I just described. The second thing that happened was that policies were set up nationally and without much coordination. In many countries, the same things were done, but without coordination, so that was rather a coincidence. The same things had to be done because banks were collapsing in almost all of our countries. And again, not just in the south of Europe. It's really a mistake to think that. One of the first banks that collapsed in Europe was in the UK. You may remember the people queuing up outside Northern Rock, a retail banker in the north of England. It was happening, saving banks at a huge cost. The taxpayers' cost was happening everywhere. The third phase was when some coordination started to happen. In G20 context, government leaders of the G20 decided to invest against the crisis. And it worked. Many countries had fiscal stimuli to push up the economy. And it worked until, of course, in Europe, the second crisis hit. The reason why that happened was because, in effect, stimulating yourself out of the crisis doesn't work if underlying your macroeconomic problems are not being solved. And the macroeconomic weaknesses in the European countries were many. So countries started losing access to markets, and that created the new phase for the Eurozone crisis. Funnily enough, it was called Euro crisis, but the one thing that wasn't in crisis was actually the currency. It remained strong and solid throughout the crisis. Countries lost access to markets, which had to do with, of course, the high sovereign debt, their structural issues, and loss of confidence in their capability to repay loans. And in Europe, emergency instruments were developed. At the start of the monetary union, such crises had, of course, not been foreseen. There was no emergency fund, there was no framework, and first bilateral loans were provided, and after that, the EFSF, as a temporary solution, an emergency fund was set up. And it was only later, roughly from 2012, that we started looking at it in a more structural way. This was accommodated, of course, by Mario Draghi in June 2012, saying, we will do what it takes to keep the euro and to support the euro. And that allowed politicians to take a decision late, but nonetheless the right decision, to set up the banking union, to really start sorting out the fundamental problems in our financial sector, and member states to push through a number of structural reforms which have dealt with competitiveness and costs in many member states. This all started in mid-2012. I became a minister at the end of 2012 and was able to work on these topics. Yes, there was also, of course, fiscal adjustment. Why do I say it in this order? Because sometimes if you listen to debates about the approach, the crisis approach in the Eurozone, people will only talk about austerity, which is a wonderful frame. It's all about austerity. Yes, there was austerity, and this was inevitable when you consider how many countries actually lost access to financial markets, simply couldn't borrow anymore. Yes, there was austerity if you realize that budget deficits were running up on average to above 6% by the time when I started as chair of the Eurogroup, the average deficit in the Eurozone was -6. So yes, there was austerity. But we took 8 years to gradually reduce these deficits. And only now are sovereign debts, on average, in the Eurozone starting to go down. Only now, after 8 years. So austerity was part of the strategy, but certainly not the key elements. The key elements was, in my mind, certainly in my agenda, getting the banking sector sound and solid, open for business, addressing the structural issues which had to do with the competitiveness, the vitality of our economies, and of course strengthening the monetary union. This was about the frameworks that we have that have been overhauled, that have been changed, the institutions that we have, and this debate is still ongoing. The whole adjustment process has been very costly in every possible way. First of all, of course, in social terms, it's been tremendously invasive in the lives of people, in the autonomy of countries, the things that had to be done. But there was also a high price to be paid in economic terms, the economic damages being huge, and in the price to be paid in political terms. Now we're in a completely different area, completely different phase. The last quarter of last year, the average growth in the Eurozone was 3.3%. Even the most optimist economists, and there aren't many as you know, even the most optimist economists would say that perhaps 2% for the Eurozone could be achievable. Every quarter last year, the estimates for growth were upgraded. The Eurozone did better than anyone would have expected. Unemployment started to go down quite rapidly in some countries. Spain is putting out new jobs at a high speed. The same is true for other program countries like Ireland. Exports are improving from almost all countries. Domestic demand has picked up and investments are improving. So the good thing is not just the Eurozone is back into growth, it's very strong growth, but also it's broad-based growth, which is important to make sure that we're not entering the next boom. I got quite a fright before Christmas when the Financial Times started writing about the Euro boom. Because as you know, the word boom is usually followed by bust. So this is the time when we should pay attention. But it's strong and broad-based growth. Also the process of divergence, where the core countries were doing better than the outskirts of the Eurozone, has been reversed, and it's now actually the opposite. And growth is higher than in the US, in Canada, and in the UK. So what now? Now that we've come out of the crisis and have such strong growth, what should we do? How should we use this period? First of all, I would argue we need to continue to strengthen the real economy, improve our competitiveness. Our productivity gains are still low. There are still too many people out of a job. Opportunities for young people in some countries are still very poor. Second thing that we should do in this period is to make the Eurozone more shock-proof. I hope the next shock will be far away, but it's going to come. We find it hard to predict always where it's going to come from, but it's going to come, and we must be better prepared than we are now. So who should do what? First of all, member states must continue to take their responsibility. As I said at the beginning, and it's still true, the member states have the biggest toolkit with the best instruments to establish economic progress, to establish financial stability. Member states have been very depending on, of course, monetary policy, which has been welcome. It's calmed everyone down. It's allowed politicians to start taking some decisions and doing difficult things. But in my mind, the monetary policy should be reduced. Its role should also go back to normal times. This is also important when you think about how to deal with the next shock. If you've used your current instruments, if you've used them to the max, your toolkit is pretty much empty. Now, you'll never hear the ECB say that the toolkit is empty. They will always say that they stand ready to do what it takes. But given the current scope and the current length of the balance sheet of the ECB, I would say the toolkit is pretty much empty. So let's also normalize the monetary policy now that we can and start refilling that toolkit for future troubles. Member states also have more work to do on the fiscal side. And I know some people think I'm too strict on this, too austere, but if you realize that a number of member states still have very high sovereign debts, and if you're a true Keynesian politician or economist, and you argue that in times of a crisis governments should spend more, then they should prepare that option now. And only if they are successful in the coming years, in this good period, to reduce those high levels of debt, will they have an option to put out fiscal stimulus in the next economic downturn. That work still needs to be done. Bank supervisors should also continue their good work. After the start of the banking union in 2014, they've gone through the banks, they've forced banks to recapitalize, to take their losses, to sell off some bad portfolios, to restructure. Some banks have been closed down. All of that has been a huge success and part of the economic recovery, because banks are open for business again. But the work's not done. There are still high levels of non-performing loans, bad loans on bank balance sheets, and credit flows are still very national. There is still little confidence cross-border in the Eurozone for banks to do business across the border. And finally, of course, the monetary union itself should be improved and reformed. And let me come to a conclusion on that topic. Last December we had a Eurozone summit. All the leaders came together, not just the 19 Euro countries, all of them were there, and we discussed the kind of reform that the monetary union itself needs. The outcome was really that the leaders said, look, some of these things are roughly agreed, let the Eurogroup get on with it, sort it out, negotiate it, design it, agree upon it, and some things are still very controversial. So the things that are roughly agreed are, first of all, to finish the banking union. Now, having said that, roughly agreed, if you dig into it, you'll still find some very controversial stuff. Some of it is very controversial in Italy, some of it is very controversial in Germany, but we've had this situation before. So yes, we must finish the banking union because it is so key to have stable, strong, sustainable growth in the Eurozone. The way we solved some of these conflicts before, when we started the banking union, was by changing the whole approach. At the start of the banking union, there was a huge conflict, roughly north-south, about who's going to pay the bill for these bad banks. And we solved it by saying, look, this is a wrong debate. It's a debate between should the public in the north pay or should the public in the south pay, whereas in fact, we needed to start shifting the bill to private investors. They are the ones who took the profits in the good years. They should accept some of the losses in the bad years. Shifting from bail out by taxpayers to bail in on investors. That principle is still true, and I think going forward, strengthening the monetary union, to think about who actually carries the risks in the economy, shifting some of those away, keeping them away from the public side, will also allow us to complete the banking union and find solutions in the political ground. Second thing that needs to be done is to really create a capital markets union. This is about having more and deeper capital markets in Europe. The European economy is very true for the Eurozone. It's very dependent on bank finance, which is also, of course, very vulnerable in case banks don't put out the credit. So we need to diversify the way we finance our corporate sector in all of our countries. We must allow capital to flow between countries, and that has been still very difficult after the crisis. We must allow, and also here Capital Markets Union is about risk-carrying capital investments rather than loans. So this is also part of the strategy to have the right kind of private risk sharing rather than public risk sharing. And the Capital Markets Union is very important to absorb future shocks. The US economy is much more financed from capital markets, to a much lesser extent by banks, and this is also a way to absorb shocks in the economy. That's why the US has recovered much quicker from the banking crisis. And finally, we need to deepen and complete the internal market. The services industry is still very much protected in different countries. There are still thousands of professions throughout the European Union that are not open to young people. So there's a lot of potential extra growth there. But we should also, and this is what the debate is always about, reform our institutes. And I think the outcome of the summit in December was, yes, we roughly agree on finishing the banking union. Yes, we roughly agree on creating that capital markets union for Europe. We also roughly agree on creating a European monetary fund. We've created a structural fund, which was called the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, to support countries that lose access to markets. And it's functioned extremely well. It's a big gun that can be put in place if there's trouble. It's very efficient, cost efficient, both on the lending side and the borrowing side, very efficient. And I think there are three ways that we can use that fund even better. The first is they are now very experienced in helping countries that are in economic trouble. We used to call them program countries. I hope that we won't have many program countries anymore, but that experience is still very valid. And I think we could build on that. The second is we need a backstop to the banking union. If a huge banking crisis were to occur, there needs to be enough credit to the institutions of the banking union to pre-finance banks. By the way, all of that would have to be repaid by banks, and this credit line could also come from the ESM. Thirdly, I think that we should need to look at the toolkit of the ESM. In fact, there are more instruments for the ESM already in its toolkit, but so far we've only used the programs, the emergency program loans. And I would be in favor, building a bit on an idea that Bundeskanzlerin Merkel had, to allow countries that come forward with their own reform plans to ask for financial support in case of in the form of a soft loan, come forward to the ESM and ask for support to help them get through that reform period. Secondly, what about the Commission and the role of the Commission? The Commission will still be very important in dealing with program countries. Again, hoping there won't be too many. The Commission will be crucial as guardian of the pact, and really has to be serious about making sure that if we have an agreement on fiscal rules or an agreement on how to deal with macroeconomic imbalances, that member states give that act responsible on that. The Commission, even though very unpopular, has that role to play. The Commission is the guardian of the pact. And of course DG Com has an importance. This is the competition authority, has a very important role to play in the bank restructuring, which is still ongoing. Do we need new fiscal instruments finally? This is one of the more controversial topics that will come back later on to the Eurozone leaders. I would argue yes, but really only for adverse shocks, which are shocks that are not going throughout the Eurozone, but only in some member states. in which monetary policy, which is for all of us and has to service the whole Eurozone, can never be good enough. So if there is a very specific shock in a specific area, then there should be the option to help that particular country. With the stabilization tool, this is now part of the French and the German proposals, a little in a different way, but I'm pretty sure that's going to also be part of the French-German deal that is being cooked up and may come out in March. I would argue, and I also heard the French Minister of Finance yesterday argue the same, such support, such financial stability support would have to go with conditionality. So countries would have to agree to deal with some of the issues that they still have for them to get this kind of support. As I said before, I think the best place to put that instrument would be at the ESM, which has proven to be effective and efficient. It could also come from the EU budget, but if you just imagine the kind of budget discussion we're going to have in the coming 2 years, this would only complicate matters. The UK leaving will cause a massive, well, I wouldn't say fight, that would not be appropriate, but let's say struggle on how to solve the problem of the financial consequences of Brexit. Some countries that are on the recipient side will have to accept less money coming to them. Countries that are on the contribuents side, they are very worried about having to pay more. This is going to be a huge issue. On top of that, there are lots of new issues for the EU to deal with, on which, by the way, everyone does seem to agree, like border control, working together on migration, fighting terrorism. All of that would also need to be reflected in the new budget. So the next budget period and trying to sort out these fiscal issues in the EU are going to be on the top of the agenda. Putting new instruments for the Eurozone into that big discussion will complicate matters. So I would argue it's much better to look at the ESM to provide that kind of financial support. Finally, member states in this whole debate about the future of the monetary union still tend to have two reflexes, both of which are wrong. The first one is all our problems are caused by Europe, and the second one is please can Europe solve my problems? And both are wrong. The crisis was not caused by the euro, the crisis was not caused by the Eurogroup or by Mario Draghi. The crisis was predominantly caused by bad national policies and huge risk-taking in the period before the crisis. And the key instruments, the key firepower is still in the hands of member states to improve and strengthen the monetary union, to improve and strengthen the national economies. And yes, working together is always a good idea. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, do you want me to stay up here?
If you want, you can certainly stay there. You can also come down if you want to. But meneer Dijsselbloem, thank you very much for this inspirational and captivating lecture, for looking back and for sharing a lot of thoughts with us about the future. I'm going to turn to the audience now. Meneer Dijsselbloem generously accepted to take some questions from the audience. I would first like to give the floor to some students to ask some questions, and then I'll open it up to everybody. Is there any student with a particular question?
Mr. Dijsselbloem, I want to ask you a question about the future of EMU. The Commission, in its communication on the future of the euro last December, proposed to create the position of a European finance minister. The Commission considers that the position of a European Minister of Finance would be an important institutional step towards a more coherent a more effective and a more accountable system of economic policy making. The Commission's view is that the European Finance Minister will act as a permanent president of the Eurogroup. And in addition, he or she will be a member of the College of Commissioners and will also act as the Vice President of the Commission. So firstly, what is your view on a possible European Finance Minister who acts as the permanent chair of the Eurogroup? Would such a European Finance Minister indeed benefit the work of the Eurogroup? And secondly, should such a European Finance Minister also be the Vice President of the Commission?
Yeah, I'll answer straight away, and I'll try to be short. So the Commission proposals put a lot of emphasis on the governance of what institution does what. Some have said, well, the Commission has put a lot of emphasis on their own role. So they would basically, one of the commissioners would lead the Eurogroup and would be the Minister of Finance of Europe. So in terms of process, I would say I think it's much more important to have a debate on substance, on the kind of instruments that we need to make it work economically. And I'm not sure that the governance issues, the institutional issues, are going to help us. So I think we could really politically get bogged down in a big fight over who controls what and who runs what. And we still haven't made any progress on substance. So that's my first remark. Second remark is, of course, it would be very welcome to have a permanent chair for the Eurogroup, though some have said, my Prime Minister, our Prime Minister has said, we have enough presence already in Europe, but a realistic question is does the chair of the Eurogroup have enough authority and responsibilities to fill a 24-hour, 24/7 job? It's been a part-time job so far. I've been able to combine it, and that was in a crisis period. So that's a real thing. The key issue is much more fundamental. The key issue is whether, if you talk about a Minister of Finance for Europe, that suggests that this man or woman has a huge scope of control, has a massive responsibility, and can act very directly and in a directive way. And I don't think it's going to be that easy. You can say we need a very big Eurozone budget and we need a Minister of Finance to be able to control that, but also to step into national policies and tell member states what to do. First of all, if you want to have a big Eurozone budget, where's the money actually going to come from? So I hear a lot of ideas about what this budget should look like and what it should be meant for, but I hear very few ideas about where's the money actually going to come from. So if it really needs to be sizable, I don't think you can get the money from just raising taxes. Taxes are already quite high in Europe. So if it really needs to be sizable, I think you need to take a chunk from the national budgets. That would make sense. I've not heard anyone very enthusiastic about that approach. Because of course, if you take out a sizable part of national budgets, you would also have to take out a sizable part of their policies. So if you look at the Dutch national budget, I think 80% of the budget is dominated by social welfare and pensions, healthcare, education. Okay, so I'll let the audience pick today which of these three should be turned over to the European Commission. And who of you would then like to stand for politician for elections here in the Netherlands? No, but it's quite serious. So creating a new sort of figure and giving him a wonderful name, the Minister of Finance for Europe, without a political logic, without a institutional setup. I mean, having one minister without having a true government doesn't seem to make sense. Without having a link between, let's say, responsibilities of going to voters and to say, okay, this is what I stand for, you can agree or not agree, and this is how I'm going to collect and spend the money. All of that has not been thought through. If the bottom line is the outcome is there will be a permanent chair for the Eurogroup, no problem at all. No problem at all. But I think that some of the proponents of this idea of a Minister of Finance have much bigger ideas, and I don't think they've been thought through very well, and I don't think they've been discussed thoroughly.
Hello, my name is Stavros Theocharis. Thank you for being here in Leiden today. I would like to ask you two things. During a session at the European Parliament, you responded to a question posed by Nikos Choudis by saying that we had a banking crisis, a fiscal crisis, and we spent a lot of the taxpayers' money in the wrong way, in my opinion. Furthermore, you said that the people criticizing us and saying that everything was being done by the benefit of the banks were to some extent right. I would like to know, why did you say that just 2 months before and not during the crisis, at least by not letting the people know that we are actually using your money, but we try to figure out how to solve this problem. I do understand that a solid banking system is necessary in order to survive, let's say. And my second question, actually it's not really a question, but we have an example of Germany in 1953 when Germany had huge problems, economical problems, and one of the solutions was to erase the debt, at least if I'm not wrong, for 50%, and to pay it in a longer period back to the countries where they got the money from.
Yeah.
And the example, this example gives, at least it shows me that this was a good way to solve the European crisis 60 years later, because as we can see, Germany has been maybe the strongest European member state.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, on the first topic of banks, I didn't start saying this only 2 months ago. As a matter of fact, I became a minister at the end of 2012, and already in February 2013, we had to nationalize a bank in the Netherlands, SNS Bank, and we did a bail-in on the shareholders and bondholders of the SNS Bank. And very shortly after that, literally weeks after that, we came to the crisis in Cyprus. We found out that Cyprus not only had a massive banking sector, far oversized for the size of this island economy. It was fully loaded with deposit holders, foreign deposit holders, many from Russia, of whom we were not sure where the money was actually coming from. But as a politician, I knew one thing, that we weren't going to save with European taxpayers' money, Cypriot taxpayers' money, these Russian deposits, very large deposits. Thirdly, the whole banking sector as it was set up in Cyprus was completely unsustainable and needed restructuring. So it was a very difficult decision. We had to do 2 rounds and adjust what we did and communicate much better. Lots of things went wrong, but the outcome was the right decision. The outcome was, to some extent, like SNS, but even deeper, because the problems were even deeper. We did a bail-in on the investors, the capital holders, and even the large deposit holders in some of the banks in Cyprus. Why do I believe that's right? We did the opposite at the beginning of the crisis in Ireland. We did the opposite in Greece. And basically, the opposite was done in other countries. Ireland also has a massive banking sector, very unsustainable. Many mistakes were made there. When the banks collapsed, they had to save their banking sector with taxpayers' money. And the sovereign debt of Ireland was, and I'm doing it by recollection now, so correct me if I'm wrong, before the crisis was 25%, and after they had to save their banks, it was 125%. And the same kind of dramatic not the same kind, because this was the most radical banking crisis in terms of debt effect. The same kind of mechanism happened in Greece. So we did it everywhere, and we did it all in the wrong way, bailing out, saving basically those who provided the capital, and making the common taxpayer pay for it. And I thought, I found out quite quickly after I started in this job that that was the wrong approach and it should be changed. We were heavily criticized at the beginning of 2013. People were screaming everywhere that we were killing the economy, killing the trust in the financial sector. But fundamentally, it was the right approach. Cyprus has come out of the program very rapidly, didn't even use the maximum of 10 billion that they could have borrowed. They, I think, in the end, borrowed about 7 billion. Their economy is recovering much quicker, and their sovereign debt is sustainable. Now, you could say, why didn't you do that with Greece? First of all, many of these decisions were taken at the beginning of the crisis. Later on, certainly in the third program for Greece, we did exactly this. We said we're not going to put that kind of money in the banks again, because all of that will be paid again by the Greek taxpayers. The owners of the banks have to bleed, and that's what happened. And it saved a lot of money in the third program. So I think we have now found the right approach. Banks can prepare for it. If ever in the future they get into problems, they know we must have buffers, we must have reserves that can be bailed in. It was a harsh way to change course, but we did it, and I did it quite early on. Given this history, and given the fact that many countries now still have a high debt, like Greece, also due to having saved the banks, I think we should help Greece with dealing with this sovereign debt. And that's what we did at the end of 2012. Mid-2012, the private sector had to take some losses. At the end of 2012, I had just become a minister. We extended the maturities, so I think the average loans went towards the 30 years. Interest rates were lowered, and we did that again in 2016. And we've said in the Eurogroup, if all goes well, if Greece completes the program, we will again look at the debt, and if necessary, take more measures to reduce the costs of this high debt. So that's a promise that stands, and that is being worked on as we speak in the Eurogroup.
Yes, my question is, in a recent interview in the Dutch magazine Vrij Nederland, you stress the importance for political leaders to not only deal with the necessities of the moment, but to also provide a vision for the future that is able to win our hearts and minds, to gain the public's trust. The vision of the Euro's founders was that the cooperation necessary for sharing a currency would include not only shared riches, but also shared responsibility, including helping each other when things go wrong. In this regard, I also have two questions. Firstly, do you think the Euro's political leaders are sufficiently clear and honest about that vision? And secondly, now that the economic necessity of the crisis is dying down and more durable reforms are being discussed, should they bring it more to the fore again?
So I think, as I said at the end of my introduction, national politicians throughout Europe always have the tendency to blame Europe for difficult and nasty decisions. This was never my idea, but Brussels is making me do this. Or, yes, we have huge macroeconomic problems, but it's not caused, of course, by our own policies or by our own government. It's caused by a European institution or a European currency. So it would be such a great idea for national politicians to be much more confrontational, even though, from my experience, you may lose the election. But you need to be more confrontational if you want to make any progress at all. And I've always realized that if, as a national politician, you say, look, this crisis has not been invented by the US. It was not about US mortgages. It's about real economic imbalances, financial instability here in the Netherlands or here in our countries of Europe. And there are things we can do about that, and we should do. And yes, it's going to be difficult. We need to accept that this crisis has cost us a certain level of wealth, so we need to take a step back. We have to accept that the easy money, the way it is used to flow before the crisis, comes at a very high price. Sometimes, if you're in a crisis, a price needs to be paid. And I strongly believe in politicians, though we've not been successful enough to take people along, that at least are honest in, look, it's not going to be an easy ride. We need to do some difficult stuff. The only thing I can promise you is that I will do it according to my political principles, which I think we did, and that at the end we will be in a better position, which we now are. So yes. And if I look at the Italian elections at the moment, and if you listen to the political programs of the various leaders in the Italian elections, I've not heard one political leader in Italy at the moment telling the Italian people as it is. Productivity is extremely low, the banks are still in a bad shape, they need to be sorted out. There need to be more investments, the investment climate in Italy needs to be improved. Some things need to be done for Italy to catch on to the rest of the Eurogroup, the rest of the Eurozone. And if the people in the Italian elections are being told, look, this is your choice, 1, 2, 3, and all three of them are telling you that life will be wonderful and there are only good things ahead, it's simply not true. There are difficult decisions to take. Anyway, I left politics, so I should give up.
We've had 3 questions from students now. Anybody else who would like to ask a question?
It may also be a student.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. You mentioned several times the European Banking Union, and you said that the work is not yet done. So I would like to ask you on the third pillar of the Banking Union, the European Deposit Insurance Scheme. While the Commission has been a strong advocate of the European Deposit Insurance Scheme and has stressed the necessity of its establishment, also in its latest communication on completing the Banking Union, the political negotiations, in particular in the Council, have led to deadlock. Countries like, in particular, Germany, are now strongly opposing the idea of moving the framework of deposit protection to European level. And what is more, there appears to be a lack of consensus in politics and in academia whether a European deposit insurance scheme is genuinely necessary for a well-functioning banking union. So therefore, my questions to you are, first, do you consider a European deposit insurance scheme necessary for a completion of the banking union? And if so, what are your suggestions for overcoming the deadlock in the political negotiations? Thank you.
Right. So you thought, let's leave the easy stuff till the end. So if you look at the substance of this topic, insurance on deposits, the main work has already been done. Before the crisis, there was also a European directive on this topic, but it was very weak and very open. And in effect, countries didn't have to prepare in advance such a deposit insurance scheme, let alone an insurance fund. Of course, it's very helpful if you build up an insurance fund, if you make the banks pay premiums to a fund, then you know for sure that if something happens, you have a fund that you can draw from. All of that wasn't done. So at the start of the banking crisis in Europe, everyone said, look, we really must have one. So the commitment became stronger. It should be up to 100,000 euro per deposit account. But still, there was no obligation to start working on funds, to build up funds. So the most important step was taken already, I think 2 years ago, when everyone committed and it was put into European law. All the member states must ex post, so in advance, build up a deposit insurance fund. And that's now actually happening. They're being filled up to a certain size. All the banks in Europe are paying fees into these national funds. So that is already a great improvement to where we were before the crisis. Now, of course, in an insurance scheme, if you make your population bigger, it has advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages are if the population is very diverse and there are many risks in some parts of the population, because that puts a lot of strain on solidarity. The good thing about creating a bigger insurance for a bigger group of people is that you can cover each other's risks much better. You can manage your risks much better if you pool your resources. If you join all these national funds together, you have a bigger bazooka, a bigger fund that you can turn to if there is a problem. So therefore, I'm very much in favor of it. I'm very much in favor of having EDIS, connecting these different funds and integrating them to one big insurance fund. But we need to deal with the other issue, the disadvantage. So if the population is very big, there needs to be quite a bit of control over the risks in the population. I think we can do that. We now have European supervisors and the European Resolution Board and the ECB and the Commission, etc. I think that's okay. So the only thing we now have to deal with is legacy issues. In a normal situation, if we hadn't just come out of a massive crisis and roughly everyone has some bad loans, so there are risks, but they are sort of scattered through the population and they are manageable, we could make that step and have this common insurance system. But unfortunately, there is a high level of concentration of risks in some parts of the population, in some of the banks. And we're in the process of dealing with that. So the second question is how to get through this. Objectively, it's quite easy, because we're taking all sorts of measures to reduce NPLs, sell these bad portfolios off, so get them out of the banks. We're making banks take more provisions, so create reserves if things go wrong. We're making banks have more equity, their own capital, to carry some of the risks in the future, etc., etc. We're doing all the right things, and gradually the problem of NPLs is being addressed. Politically, of course, the Germans can continue to say, but not good enough. So, a lot of people have been positive about the outcome of the Große Koalition, the paper that has come out in the talks between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats in Germany. I was slightly disappointed. There was not a word about finishing the banking union in there. And even though, also during the Eurozone summit, if you would ask the leaders in the room, what is the most important thing? What should we do first? Everyone, including the Bundeskanzlerin, would say banking union, that's first. But not a word in the Große Koalition agreement. The second thing is they were very positive about the ESM becoming a European Monetary Fund, but said nothing about what is it that this new fund would actually do. So that was also a slight disappointment. But anyway, on the banking union, it's still difficult. I think we're doing the right things. We're making progress in reducing the risks. So the advantages of stepping into a common insurance system are growing as we go through and get rid of all the risks. And I hope that President Macron is successful in convincing the Germans that the first thing we should do, the first next step, is completing the banking union.
It is about, will we miss the British banking sector after a Brexit?
The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is I don't think we can do without the city. Perhaps not so much the banking sector. The financial sector is, of course, broader than just the banks. And in a number of financial services, the city has a crucial role that I don't think can be easily replaced. But part of it will be replaced. I think it's inevitable. It's not so much in, well, I won't speculate. Part of it will be replaced, which perhaps is a good thing. The high level of concentration of financial services in one center could also be a risk. So perhaps for the future it's good that we have a few financial centers throughout Europe and that some of these are in the Eurozone. But we will still depend for certain markets very much on the city, I'm convinced. So I also believe it's very much in our common interest to sort this out. Between us and the UK, I mean.
Luc van Middelaar, Leiden University. I have a personal but also political question. It is short. Will you now also write your memoirs? I will say a few words about it, because I'm not asking it just to citizen Dijsselbloem as you now are. Maybe we want to know whether he will go make money somewhere or fish in the Rhine or write his memoirs. It's not that type of question. I'm asking writing memoirs also as a political act. During 5 years, you were not only witness but also actor in episodes of high political drama. You have mentioned Cyprus. There was also Greece, about which 2015, you just briefly alluded to that. And of course, some of the other players in that drama have given us their version of the story. A famous one is your former Greek colleague Yanis Varoufakis, a book called Adults in the Room. It's a very well-written book. Huh? You appear, by the way, of course, as one of the characters. I would not necessarily say as a good guy, but as a strong character, by all means. And, well, you were asked, I think, in the press also about it, and you said, well, I've read a bit of it, and I don't agree with everything what he says. But I think we is not, well, maybe we in the room, but we, the European public, we would like to know a little bit more, perhaps, of what happened behind closed doors, who said what, when. Because now, I'm afraid we'll have to rely on some journalist stories that are also here in the room, on Mr. Varoufakis, and it would be great to also have the Dijsselbloem version of these years, 2013, 2018, of the Eurogroup. Thank you for your thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question. So, Mr. Varoufakis was a finance minister for 5 months. And yes, I will write the book, but it will not be a response to Mr. Varoufakis for many reasons. One is that I was in a job for 5 years and he in 5 months, so that makes it sort of incompatible. Second, in these 5 years, very serious people have worked very hard to sort out the problems. And there was one particular guy during 5 months which tried to do everything to make things worse. And I usually don't make these comments, but I know that you were also involved in many of these events in Brussels. I have found in Brussels, and much is the same for The Hague, politicians are pretty much serious people who are aware of the responsibilities they carry and the risks they have to take, and at the end of the day they will have to face the voters, etc. And it's extremely difficult to sort out such huge economic and political issues if there's one man in the room that simply only did damage in political terms, in confidence, inside and outside the Eurozone. And most sad was the damage to Greece itself. So I've put in, you're right, I didn't say much about the summer of 15, when Greece almost exited. I put in all my time and energy to keep Greece in, to get other countries to accept that, and for Greece to accept the terms and to have a serious package. But we had to come a very long way after all the damage Mr. Varoufakis did. So, now that I've said all that, I don't have to put it in the book anymore. The book will be about 5 years in the Eurogroup, going through the Euro crisis. It'll go back a little bit in time, as I did today, to understand the crisis. Why did we get into this crisis? What did we do? Why did we do it? It won't be specific on who said what. I'll have to disappoint you there. But if the colleagues allow me, perhaps I shall quote them, but otherwise I shall respect their, how do you say? Well, yeah. As you know, the meetings of the Eurogroup are behind closed doors. Sometimes I regret that. Very often I'm very happy about that, because otherwise it will be even more difficult to get things done. So that makes it always a little difficult to be fully open in such a book. But I agree with you that it's very important, certainly after such a period in which such drastic decisions were taken, had to be taken, that people look back and also make explicit why they took these decisions, in what circumstances, what compromises, why, by whom. I think it's important for historic reasons, I think it's important for political reasons, but most of all for democratic reasons. Because if people criticize the democratic legitimacy of some of the things we did, they have a point. And in normal circumstances, this is not the way we should do it. And this should be a motivation for all of us to make sure that we don't end up in this kind of crisis again. The strain it has put on our democracies, on our frameworks, on our institutions, the things we've asked from our European institutions to do, has not been reasonable. It's far beyond what could be expected and should be expected in normal times. This is not what we've built the Commission for. This is not what we built the ECB for. They did it. They extended all their powers to try and sort it all out. But the strain we've put on institutions, and therefore also on our democracy, has been huge. So let's make sure we don't get there again. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this first part of this event, the formal, the official part. I would like to invite you all now to a small reception in the faculty club at the other end of the academic building. If you want to talk about what you've heard, or if you want to ask perhaps Mr. Dijsselbloem some additional questions. I thank you all for being here, and I hope, of course, that I'm going to see you all again during the next activities of the Europa Institute. But if this has been a truly wonderful event, and in my opinion it has been, my thanks, of course, go in the first place to you, Mr. Dijsselbloem, President of the Eurogroup, citizen Dijsselbloem now. It was inspirational, it was captivating, it was exactly as I hoped it would be. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hebben een klein cadeautje mee. Voor de auto's een paar bloemetjes en ook. Dit is een ets van het academiegebouw. Hier heeft het plaatsgevonden, het is een oude tekening. En ik hoop dat u die mooi vindt en er een plekje kan aan geven.
Dank u wel.
Fantastisch. Dank u veel.